So an interesting thought that I've been thinking about recently is that reason, narrative, and rhyme can only emerge in retrospect. Think about it, really. Reason, rhyme, stories can only emerge in retrospect. Now, this applies to many fields out there. Applies to anthropology, applies to human studies, applies to literature, applies to history, of course, and also applies to your own personal story as well. You have to first write the novel before you can truly see any structures beneath that novel. You have to go through that period in history before you can spot this reason, this rhyme, or this overarching story about that piece of history. You have to develop a scientific theory first before you can critique it. Einstein has to come up with general relativity to rock the boat, so to speak. So that brings us to the question of how can we know what the future holds? And that brings us to the burning question on teenagers' mind or young people's mind that how do I live my future life? What career I should choose? What sort of people I should get into relationships with? What sort of books I should read in the future? What sorts of people should I associate myself with? And what sort of acts that would assist me to become an adult? And ultimately, how do I live my life so that I can be happy? So all these burning questions that we have, this fear of the future, so to speak, and this fear of the uncertainties that comes up ahead of us, this is all the stuff that we can't foresee. Because ever till now, you've lived maybe 20 years, you've lived maybe 30 years, and maybe you've lived for a long, long time, I don't know. But a cohesive identity or a cohesive self-narrative can only become evident once you look back at your life story, as you look back at what happened before. So that means we don't exactly have the luxury of foreseeing to the future. Have we not lived long enough? So the development of wisdom really is being able to spot some key lessons in retrospect. But for younger folks, we don't have that many years around. We don't have that much experience, so it's impossible for us to see what the future holds. So whenever I talk about choosing a career as you were very young, as I talk about it at the back of my mind, I'm always saying to myself, well, what if it changes in the future? What if there's a fart at the back of my mind that just pops out once in a while and say to me, you should completely change all your career ideas, or some new opportunity comes up, or some new person that I bumped into. All these little events can drastically alter your life's decisions. All these little events can drastically change the course of your life. And it is these little events that we fear the most because it takes away our cravings, so to speak, to live on a cohesive narrative. So as we're young, we like to construct what I would call fantasy dreams. So we think things are a certain way. But as we enter into the real world and we experiment around, we screw around in the system, we find out that a lot of this stuff is not grounded anywhere in reality. A lot of this stuff is just fantasy that we thought up. So therefore, we run into crises. We run into uncertainty. And then we run into identity conflicts. This is the main stuff that I want to talk about today. And today I would argue that it's okay not to have that direct certainty of what you want to do in the future. It's okay not to have that. And we're really going to rely by argument upon the works of Michel Foucault. And you might be scratching your head wondering, what does Foucault have to do with helping teenagers to eradicate some of the uncertainties and the miseries that we have? Well, it's actually extremely significant. Now, a big tradition of postmodern philosophy is that they like to do things across disciplines. So therefore, drawing overlinks and overarching themes in postmodern philosophy is not some object, so to speak. It's very hard to define what postmodern philosophy is, but instead it's a frame of thinking, a frame of deconstructing present objects that have a sense of permanence. And it's about taking them apart and then seeing the historical consequences of these objects. So I'm not going to bore you with the details, but here's a really quick crash course on Foucault. So after this crash course on Foucault, you can sort of see what I'm driving at when I say you don't exactly need dead certainties for your future. You don't exactly need a cohesive narrative to have a good future. You don't exactly have to know every chess pieces on the board for you to make decisions into the future. And this sort of eradicates, or this sort of alleviates some of our uncertainties about the future. So here's a very, very quick crash course on Foucault, so to speak. And also just a quick reminder, this is just what I've learned so far. There might be a lot of holes in the theory, but what I'm interested in is picking out what's relevant to us, what's relevant to real life, to apply philosophy in a real life sort of context. Instead of doing armchair philosophy, getting all the facts right, let me see what's happening on a global scale. Let me see what's happening on a holistic scale. So Foucault is a historian or historical philosopher. So that's the sort of thing within postmodern tradition, is that these philosophers work in different fields. For example, Derrida is a linguist, and he started to work on a philosophy of language. But Foucault, his area of study specifically is history. So what Foucault is interested in is, why are there cohesive narratives within history? Now, here's an interesting fact. You know that history is not actually a permanent story? Have you noticed this? History is not some permanent lineage story that you construct. These stories are only constructed in retrospect. What actually is history? History is something that happened in the past where there were fragments left behind, where there were little facts and pieces left behind, and the task of a historian is to piece all those pieces together and somehow construct a narrative out of it. So Foucault would say, well, why would we construct these facts in that specific way? Why do we have such a craving for a cohesive narrative? Why do we have such a dominant view of history? And why do we have such an objective and permanent view of certain concepts, theories, and certain frames of thinking? Why do we think that we have the privilege to assign whatever thinking that we have upon the past? Why do we say that our frames of looking at history is the right frames of looking at the history? Because what you're essentially doing is taking a bunch of raw material and you're interpreting the story within it. But Foucault would ask, why would you think that your way of interpreting this story is the right way? How do you know that your story building is not relied upon some premises that you've ignored? How do you know that your history is the right sort of history? In actuality, history can be interpreted in many other facets, right? It can be interpreted in many other ways of interpretation. So then Foucault went on to the concept of disjunction, disruption, and then this sort of perspective shift. So Foucault would argue that throughout history, if we were to take on a linear perspective on history, that actually wouldn't make much sense. Because within history, there are disjunctions. Within history, there are bursts of progress where the progress is discontinuous, where one line of lineage, it bursts into another frame of thinking, or a complete paradigm shift, or a complete revolution of thought, where the history would disjoint itself, where the history would self-destruct, and then a new lineage would have to take on hold. It's kind of like you passing the little stick to your mate so he can run another couple miles ahead of you. Sort of like passing the flag, where history stops at one point, where someone came up with a completely different frame of revolutionary thought, where now he's reasoning from a different way of looking at things, a complete paradigm destruction, where now human beings are operating on this different field. They're on a different playing field now, and then they start to slowly accumulate knowledge. So then Foucault would argue that history is not a gradual process or a gradual exercise of accumulating knowledge. History is not merely us becoming more and more aware, but history is actually a series of disjunctions and a series of revolutionary insights that carries us into brand new discoveries, brand new territories of discovery. So it's not merely, oh, here's an old framework and now let's build on this framework and then you have this tower of history. No, Foucault would argue that it is these disjunctions that people tend to avoid when they do history, because disjunction tend to disrupt your entire narrative. And then this craving for us to seek a cohesive narrative within history is the problem that Foucault's critiquing against. So therefore, Foucault wrote numerous books exploring these disjunctions. And his first book, Madness and Civilization, explored the disjunctions of madness, explored why are there certain shifts in perspectives when we take a look at madness, so which I find pretty darn interesting. But the main thing that we're looking at today, in the context of teenagers finding their life's direction, are going to be these disjunction points, are going to be these disjunction ways of looking at the world, so to speak. So in a historical perspective, it all makes perfect sense. Some guy, he's looking at the world in a certain way. For example, the Orthodox Christian tradition, they looked at the world in terms of a theistic perspective, right? This is what a lot of people ignore these days, is that paradigms are so powerful that if you ask a Christian, what do you think of the world? He literally sees the world as created by God. If you ask an atheist, for example, I'm an atheist, hypothetically speaking, I'm not strictly an atheist, but for example, I'm an atheist. The paradigm is so powerful that when I look out into the world, that is exactly what I see, right? So you could argue that in a historical perspective, some Christian guy came up with a frame of theory, or the Orthodox Christian ways of looking at the world, and that's the steady accumulation of knowledge. But then there's a disruption somewhere in the timeline where this entire framework gets disrupted, where science starts to take hold, where certain individuals within history, for example, Galileo, Kepler, and people like Copernicus, these people came along and screwed up the entire the Christian way of looking at the world, Orthodox Christian way of viewing the world. And then you get this continuous jump where people start to really see the world in a different way, where the definition of science start to change, where the definition of objective truth start to change, where the epistemic foundation of everything start to get flipped upside down. So therefore, as we reason from this new junction point, there's going to be another steady accumulation of knowledge within a specific field, but then there's going to be another disjunction somewhere. These disjunctions are paradigm shifts. There's no way for you to go back, or there is a way for you to go back, but these paradigm shifts are so powerful that people literally start to view the world in very different ways. That's why I refer to some of the philosophy stuff that I talk about. I consider philosophy as playing with fire, because it is screwing up the epistemic foundation of how you look at the world. It is literally deconstructing your reality and then viewing it in a brand new way, recontextualization. So you no longer relate to the same things in the same way anymore. So let's not get off on a tangent here. How does paradigm shift applies to teenagers' uncertainties about the future? Well, if you think of yourself as a piece of historical study, if you were to start to record your own history from the moment that you were born, a very interesting things start to happen. We all know that throughout various cognitive development stages, the infant's perceptions start to change. The infant's way of looking at the world start to drastically alter. You don't look at the world the same way as you did when you were 2 years old. So how similar it is, and how obvious of an interlink can we draw between our own psychological development and Foucault's theory of disruption, disjunction, and paradigm shifts? You see, whenever you start to interact with the world, as you grow up, there are moments of, as Erik Erikson would describe, crises within the psychosocial model. There are these moments of disjunctions, and there are these moments of decision points, crises, where your perception of the world start to morph and start to change and really start to fall apart and then get reconstructed. So over this period of disjunction, over this period of you constructing a more accurate view of reality, so to speak, you are slowly becoming a different human being. And notice that whenever your worldview take on a new lineage, you must by necessity view the world in that new way of looking at the world. It's impossible for you to go back and then somehow close your ears and put on your blindfolds and not look at the new paradigm shifted perspective. It's very hard to do that. You'd have to be some really self-denial fool to be able to do that. You have to be really stuck in your own head in order for you to do that. But as you come in contact with reality, as you become more aware of what culture is, what society is, what everything is, as you start to become more self-educated, disjunction points start to arrive. And these, your cohesive narrative then, when you were 2 years old, or when you were 5 years old, you want to become an astronaut. Because if you say you want to become an astronaut, that's actually what you want to do. But then there's going to be a disjunction where you start to realize the actualities, where you start to perceive reality in a different way. For example, you go into elementary school and you start to learn about what it actually takes to become an astronaut. What it actually means to be an astronaut, and you combine all the facts together and you get this aha moment of, oh my God, being an astronaut is not what I thought it was. It's way harder than I thought, and I probably don't like it, right? And so you get this disjunction point where you have this big realization, and that really smashes your worldview apart. And then your worldview is going to get reconstructed, and you start to think, okay, if I'm not going to become an astronaut, what else would I be? Okay, do I want to be an artist? Then you spend a couple of years going through that lineage, slowly progressing yourself on that lineage. But one day you're going to hit this curve of, oh my God, there's another revelation coming, and there's another frame of understanding. You say to yourself, I really love art. And art is such a beautiful thing, and look at all these progressions in present art history, and you start to actually expose yourself more to this art thing. You get this revelation, and you look at art in a different way, and from that point, it's impossible for you to go back. So you see, your own development is a series of discontinuous jumps. Discontinuous jumps. Now, with regards to certainty or uncertainty, adolescents, including myself, nowadays, what we're trying to do is that people are urging us to find one career path. People are urging us to conform to one career track for the rest of our lives. And then we get really scared because what if I want to change my mind? What if some event happened that's going to disrupt my entire worldview again? So this is the fear that we have when people tell us you have to pick one thing and stick to it. And then you really have to love it. It is as if I sent you to a buffet and you've never been to a buffet, never had any of the fancy food, and I force you to pick one dish, just one dish, and you have to really enjoy it. How challenging and how challenging of a decision would that be? So tie it all together back. Your own life story is a series of discontinuous jumps. And throughout your teenage years and throughout your adolescent years and into your early adulthood, this is something that I became more and more aware of. The more that I start to grow up, the more that I start to discover some of this stuff. The older you get, the more discontinuous jumps that you're going to experience. Our level of understanding of the world right now is at an infancy stage. We really have to read more. We really have to interact with more people, and getting to jobs and get involved with society to know what the hell this is all about. And throughout that process, we get discontinuous jumps. So the way that you're viewing the world right now is not all there is. There are more discontinuous jumps to come. And then when you get those revelations, your decisions are going to start to change. You are going to change. Your entire identity is going to get reconstructed. You're going to be a drastically different person. If you think about it, you yourself right now is drastically different from you 2 years ago. And then you would argue that if you wait around for another 4 years, you're going to be a drastically different person. So by then, can you make even more sensible decision in the future? By then, after those revelations, can you really come up with a cohesive view or cohesive way of viewing the world? So that's my plea, or that's how I tied Foucauldian analysis with maturity and with how we come to resolve these uncertainties of the future. Don't worry about it, because in the future you're going to undergo some revelations. You're going to undergo some new interesting stuff, and you're going to undergo some very interesting insights. So the best that we can do right now is to stick to a course that we think makes sense, to embrace the uncertainty, to stick on a course that we think makes sense. But also, on the other hand, we must actively educate ourselves to expose ourselves more and more to the world. So the possibility of getting this revelation becomes higher and higher. So by then, when we get older, with all these self-education stuff and with all this information along with all the other stuff that we do, can we make sensible decisions? So that's my take on maturity, Foucauldian analysis, disjunction, paradigm shift. It's a long episode because there's a lot of stuff to cover. Anyways, Robin here from the Quirky Inquiry, signing off right about now.